Well, first of all, my apologies for the fact that the video has not worked this week. We ran into some problems with our video equipment, and so today I'm doing an audio, kind of a retake of what Sunday's sermon was. And so I know I'm not going to be able to give everything just as I did on Sunday, but I at least want to give you guys a map of where we went, looking at the second part of Exodus. And so first we kind of want to look at the fact that we need to understand a little bit about the world of Exodus, understanding that you're talking about Egypt, and directly east of Egypt, you've got the Sinai Peninsula. And there around the Sinai Peninsula, you have two bodies of water which are called different gulfs today. But in that day and age, both of those would have been known as the Red Sea. And as you go east over the Red Sea, you come into the area of Midian, which is where Moses would have been after leaving Egypt and ending up where he met his father-in-law Jethro and his wife Zipporah. And so we looked into last week about the showdown between the gods of Egypt and Yahweh God. And so we run into kind of what is the goal of Yahweh in all of this. And this section tends to show us and prove to us that Yahweh is the God of movement. One of the things about Yahweh that's really specific is that He is always meeting people where they are, and He is always challenging them to go further than they are. And so, one of the beauties that we find throughout the Bible is that God is not affixed to a specific location, but He is around all and in all of the entire creation of the world that He created. And so when we look at the story of Exodus, if we're just kind of flipping through super fast, we have crossing the sea. We have in chapter 15, this bitter water becomes fresh. In 16, you have bread from heaven. In 16, again, you end up with the quail and frosted flakes. In 17, you have water from a rock. Again, in 17, you have the day of victory against Amalek. Then you have from 18 through 40, you see all about the temporary camp at Mount Sinai, along with the instructions for the temporary temple. You see also that God is not like other gods. A lot of the laws, a lot of the stuff that we come across throughout this ending section of Exodus is about proving that Yahweh is not wanting to look like the gods of Egypt in any way. And so a lot of those laws have to do with that. Then you have in chapter 20, you have the covenant between God and His people, the Israelites, the Jews. And then in chapters 33 through 34, you have kind of the new covenant, where there was a brokenness in the covenant and you have this renewal. So if we back up and go about this just a little bit different, and so I'm going to back up to 15 and 16, and we're going to talk about this God of movement and meeting people where they are. And so you have this situation where the Israelites have crossed the Red Sea and they're out into the wilderness. And one of the things we have to understand about wilderness is here where I sit in northeast Louisiana, if I talk about wilderness, I'm talking about pine trees and oak trees, and I'm talking about grassy areas and underbrush and the possibility of snakes and alligators and the things like that happen to be in our general area. But when we talk about the wilderness in the Sinai Peninsula, what we're talking about is very rocky, mountainous terrain, a lot of rocks and dust and debris. And when we talk about even like the valleys and the fields that are there, we're not talking about plush green valleys for the most part. You have a few of those throughout that area, but when you get away from the sea, you end up in these areas where the grass is grown from the dew that falls, and out of that you get these little bitty sprigs of grass that pop up, and whatever animals are out there are going to take advantage of that, but they're not generally sitting on an open green field like what we often think of when we think of a park or an open green area like that. And so you see the Israelites cross the Red Sea, and you see them entering into this area where they're no longer close to the sea, but they come across this water source, this lake. And this lake has plenty of water to drink in it, but it is tepid. It is bad to the taste. It is just not good. And so what you have is God says, okay, fine. What is here is not good for you. And so what I will do is I will give you a way to make it fresh. And so God tells Moses, says, cut this tree down that's on the side, throw it into the water, and the water becomes fresh. And it's not just water that it becomes not bad, but it says it actually becomes very pleasant and very pleasing. And so our lesson from that, and we look in that, is that God doesn't want to just give us an okay life, an okay sustenance, but he wants to give us something that is excellent, something that is great. Same can be said with kind of the next challenge. So they now have fixed the first thing that goes wrong when you end up out in a dry place away from everything is you get thirsty, but then you begin to get hungry as well. And so you have the start of this thing called manna. And manna literally means, what is it? And so you have this manna, this what is it that falls from heaven that is there to give sustenance. And the Israelites are grateful and they are thankful to have this there. But something begins to happen even in that, just in the continuation of chapter 16 there. After a few days of chomping on manna, they begin to misremember their history. And what I mean by that is this. So often for all of us, when we think about our past, we move from this place of being historical in nature, which historical means that we are people that remember where we came from, both the good and the bad. And we become people who tend to blow up the past. We tend to make it better than it actually was, and we tend to focus on only the positive. And in that process, we don't become historical, we become nostalgic. And nostalgia is basically looking and going, not only do we love where we came from, but we really wish we could go back to there. And so that becomes a big problem for the Israelites. And so they're there and they begin to misremember their past and understand when the Israelites first went to Egypt, they came as guests. But over a 430-year time frame, they moved from guest to slave. And so when we think about the life that most of these people would have lived, we're talking about a life of servitude, a life of subservient living. And so something that's interesting that begins to happen is that these Israelites begin to improperly remember their past, and they begin to remember the pots of meat that they would sit around and consume. And the chances are that never really happened that way, but that is their remembrance, when they were safe, when they knew where everything was and where things were coming from. And they knew, while it didn't necessarily always feel safe, there was a safety in knowing your place. And here they are, they're out in the wilderness, and they're having to rely on a God that they did not know very well. And he's shown up in some pretty amazing ways, but will he continue to show up day in and day out? And so what God does is he goes, fine, you want meat? I'll give you meat too. And so there's the situation where dew comes down onto the ground and the quail cover the ground, and they take as many as they want and they eat. And it says that when they leave, they left behind what is flakes of frost. And this kind of is the moving forward. This is the manna. This is what continues day in and day out, that sustains them for the next 40 years, as it turns out. And so that's kind of what's going on in 15 and 16. And 17, you end up with this other story that's incredibly interesting to me. When we looked back at the story of Noah back almost 20 generations ago now, you have Noah who is bringing about the hope of humanity, and he does that in escaping the water through an ark. We go just 30 years prior to what's going on here, and we have Moses. When Moses is taken and he is born and he is placed in a basket and floated down the Nile, the term within that, the Hebrew word that is used, is not basket, but the word that is used is ark. And so you have this wooden structure that comes through the water, and through that, deliverance is administered. And so you have that both with Noah, and then you have it again with Moses. And then you saw just a couple of chapters ago, about 4 chapters ago, you had the Israelites, as they were running from the Egyptians, they come to the edge of the water, and the water seems to be what is separating them from deliverance. And then comes this stick. this stick, this staff that Moses carries, and he takes, and God says to place it in the water. And when he places it in the water, it divides the water. And when that happens, the water is pushed aside, the ground is made dry, and the Israelites cross the Red Sea on dry land. And then the Egyptians, as they try to go through this very same place, the sea collapses around them. And so now this very same rod is used, this very same staff, this stick, this piece of wood that was used to divide the water. As they have moved from the watering hole, they get to a place where there is no water, and God points out a rock. And he says, I can command everything on earth. And so take that wood that was used to divide the water, and out of it will come water. And so it's interesting to me as we look through this, we have this continuation of water and wood that are going forth in this history of time as being a representation of the deliverance. If you will, let's just say this was kind of the earliest baptism. And a lot of this is where we believe that the New Testament concept of baptism actually began, is through this process of washing and crossing these great gulfs in life. So that's kind of interesting places where God is showing up and showing them that God is, as long as they are truly on the move, God is going to supply for them all that they need. So then you move into the kind of the remainder of this whole chapter, and you come across something. The next three things that I've got is the temporary camp at Mount Sinai, the temporary temple, and not like other gods. And in that, what we see is we see the beginning of this concept of God working with the Israelites. And he says, guys, I don't want you to set your roots here. I don't want this to be your forever home. What I want you to do is I want you to be willing to move where I need you, where I desire you, where I want you. And in that, we as first, as New Testament Christians, need to realize that we are living in a place that isn't our permanent home. And so while we do some investing, while we do some laying down of our family and our lives and kind of planting in this one place, we should remember that earth is not our forever home. And so that we should begin to remember that our allegiance is not to a flag or to a people or to a community, but our allegiance is to God and the kingdom that he has made us for and that he is preparing for us. And so in this we see several events in Mount Sinai and on the in the way of understanding how the temple is to be made, and even in these laws that God doesn't want the same sacrifices that the pantheon of gods of Egypt wanted. So we often see all of these laws, and we see things about how to make sacrifices, and we see how to dress when going in, and one of the things that we've so often failed to see is that this is not mere stipulations that say this is how I should be served, but it's quite often God standing and going, all right, these false gods that you made for the people you were enslaved to, those gods, those aren't me. And so I don't want you to make an engraved statue and call that me, because that's not me. When you look around and you see the trees and you see the sky and you see the stars and you see the birds and you see the animals, that is me, because that is who I am. I am the creator. When you see things like take a day of rest, it's take a day to remember that you didn't do all of this. If you don't stop and smell the roses, literally, you can begin to think that you are the master of your universe. But when you realize that you have no power over the trees or the water or the air or the sky, it is in those times that you can remember who God is and who you aren't. And so that's what that segment is all about to me, about looking at God being the God of movement, but God being the God that is not like other gods. This is the God that loves humankind. And so then we look at kind of this last section that we're going to talk about, and it's the covenant. It is this this first covenant where Moses is up on the side of Mount Sinai and he is engulfed in this shroud of clouds and thunder and lightning and all that's going on there. And he is receiving the word of God, but it's not just him receiving the word of God, it's everyone hearing the word of God. Several years ago, in doing a study of this Mount Sinai experience, I came across an old Jewish understanding of what's going on there. And so when we see in chapter 20, there's a statement, and it's right around verse 20, verse 19, verse 20, in that area, and it uses a term that is unusual. And the term is that God was there in the thunderings, plural, and in the lightnings, plural. Those aren't words that we typically have pluralized. And so when I came across that, I just had to ask, what is going on there? And so what this Jewish non-Jesus focused, non-New Testament focused book came out with was that there's an understanding that in this, God was speaking to everyone. And so when you see the term lightnings, the way that was described in this book was that the lightnings were these individual flames of tongues that rested next to each one's head. And when it spoke, the speaking was the thunderings, and it spoke in all 72 known languages of the world at one time. And what that meant was that everyone on earth could hear the law of God in their own language. And so this is an illustration that kind of takes us back to the day of Pentecost in the New Testament, where we see this idea that when Peter is given this great sermon on the day of Pentecost, that he is coming at this from a place that in which everyone hears the new law of God, this new understanding of God, this Jesus guy. They get to hear that in their own language as well. No one is exempt from understanding who God is, in other words. So then you have the situation where Moses comes down after hearing all this, and after chapter 20, we get a lot of other laws and directives that are in there, but that's all happening kind of at the same time. And Moses is writing down on the tablets, he's writing down these laws, these 10 major laws, and he's keeping track of these others. So he comes down the mountain and he sees this situation where a group of people have made a golden calf to worship. I think we can often just get really upset and go, what idiots would stop there and make it idol? But I think we also forget when we do that this is a group of people who just recently came out of a different understanding of religion, a different understanding of following God. And the people that they lived with, the Egyptians that they were around, they served God in a different way, and they needed something in front of them to see and to focus on when they were praying and that kind of stuff. And so you have them taking what is a god of fertility, this bull. The Egyptian god of fertility is a bull, much like most of the culture in that day and era, and that bull gets translated into almost every pantheon of gods in that day and age, and most commonly that bull is known as Baal. And so you have essentially the transition of God not being the God of fertility, but all of a sudden they're seeing him as an understanding of Baal. And he says, that's not me. And so when Moses comes down, he breaks the tablets. Now I want to address that really quick because I want us to understand that the breaking of tablets is not out of just anger. In order to understand covenants and to understand what God and Moses are doing, we actually need to go back and look at Genesis chapter 15, where God makes his covenant with Abraham. And the term that's used in there is that they are cut a covenant. The cut is literally what they would do is they would take an animal. In Abraham's standpoint, it was a perfect bull, a perfect cow, a calf that they would take, and they would cut it in half. And when they would cut it in half around its belly, they would take and pull the head and the upper shoulders to one side, and they would pull the tail and the lower hips to the other side. And in that, there would be a blood trail through the middle. And the traditional understanding of covenants is that both parties of the covenant, both of those agreeing to it, would have terms on both sides, and they would both walk through the blood trail. And what that would signify is to say, I vow to you to keep the promise of this covenant, and if I fail, you may treat me as this cow. You may cut me in half and you may kill me, because that is how strong the bond of my word is. I promise I will do it. And so in this, you have a situation where let's look at Abraham's. Abraham, you have this original covenant, and then you have something that's really unique. Only one entity walks through the blood in Abraham's covenant, and we can assume that something very similar to that happens in Moses' standpoint. And in Abraham's, it says that only God walked through the covenant. God said, I will be your God. And he doesn't ask Abraham to walk through a covenant because he understands humanity. He understands the fallenness and sinfulness of man. And he goes, I know if you walk through there, you're going to have to die. And so he chooses to only himself walk through. So then we look at that. Let's take that into account. Let's go back to the breaking of the tablets of the covenant. Most people in our time, in our era, look at the Ten Commandments as being all about what we're going to do for God. But there is one in there that is about what God is going to do for us. So the first four commandments of the covenant are about how humanity is to treat God. Have no other God before me, make no graven images, keep a Sabbath, and don't take my name in vain. And so in those, we have those of how humanity is to treat God. The next five, is about how humanity is to treat humanity. Don't kill, don't steal, don't destroy, don't have affairs, don't do all of these things to humankind. And then you're left with this last one, this 10th commandment, that often is one that's really difficult because people see it as a command, but the original Hebrews did not see this that way. What they saw was this last one, which is thou shalt not covet. That the best way to understand that is not that, because coveting is something you can't see. So if you covet me or something that I have and you desire it and want it, I can't see that on the outside. Now, if you steal from me, I can tell. If you kill me to get it, we can tell. But we can't just tell that you want it. And so therein lies the weirdness of this last one. But the old Hebrew understanding to this is that if you live by these first 9s, with the 4 being how you treat God and the next 5 how you treat one another, the 10th one is actually God's blessing. If you will live by all of these things, you will not want someone else's lives. You want what they have. You don't want to live their life. You don't want their possessions, their spouse, their whatever, because you are living in the will of God, and therefore you only want what you have. And so when Moses then takes and he breaks these commandments, what he says is, God, we have already broken. We didn't even get past number 2 of the first 9. And so we no longer hold you, God, responsible for the promise that you made us. And God says to Moses and to the people, hey, let's climb back up the mountain and let's rewrite this bad boy. And so what you see in 33 and 34 is you see Moses and God reconnecting, re-interacting, and then working out this new understanding of the covenant, which is the same that it was. And so the big takeaway from all of this, the big part that I really want everyone to walk away with is we will live life understanding our history. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Will we live life understanding our history as it was, both good and bad? Or will we live life only exaggerating the great points and desiring to go back in history? God doesn't want us to move backwards. He is always working with us to move us forward. And so, in all of this, being a person of God, as being a person of New Testament and Old Testament understanding of who God is, and taking on the Christian values for our world, we should always desire to understand the past as to not duplicate the mistakes, but always moving forward to see what God has around the corner for us. And so that is the sermon, as best I can remember it, that I gave earlier on this week on Sunday. And so I pray that this has helped you in some way. I pray that you have gained not just information, but hopefully some transformation through the process. And I hope that God blesses you this week. May He anoint your eyes so that you see Him at work. May He anoint your ears so that you can hear His voice. May He anoint your feet so that your path is marked by His words. And may He anoint your hands so that everything you do is in Him. Amen. God bless. Have a great week. Goodbye.